Okay, today we're going to look at suffering in Of Mice and Men. Remember, one of the key things that you've got to do when you're writing about Of Mice and Men is relate to the points that you're making about a theme, about a character, about a situation. You've constantly got to relate it to the context. So you've got to relate it to the social, historical and cultural context of 1930s America. And that's one of the things that we're going to be trying to focus on and trying to think about as we look through the suffering in the novel. The first group of people that we're going to focus on are the migrant workers. For them, travelling around from ranch to ranch, partly because of the Dust Bowl and the economic migration of workers as they're looking for work in states where the land is still good and there are still farming jobs available, partly because of the Great Depression in the 1930s following the 1929 Wall Street crash. You've got lots of migrant, itinerant workers travelling around from ranch to ranch looking for work that often wouldn't be secure. And for them, everything is transitory, meaning nothing is permanent. Nothing's fixed, nothing's forever. Everything is there one minute, gone the next. They might have a job for the next week, for the next month, but at any point the employer could turn around and say, I don't need you anymore. A quote to support this would perhaps be when Candy is talking to George and Lenny on page 40. He says, he's talking about Whitey, this blacksmith who used to have one of the beds that George and Lenny's going to have, and he says, give me my time one night, the way any guy would. Now, this is common practice. It's not unusual for men to be there just a few days, a few nights, a couple of weeks, whatever, and then to say, right, I'm off. So it stops people from forming those really close bonds, putting down any roots, forming close relationships, or feeling secure and stable in their lives. The second point is that these migrant workers are labelled and stereotyped. And the best quote I would use for this is where Curly's wife is talking to them and talks about talking to a bunch of bindle stiffs, she says, when she's talking to Lenny and to Crooks and to Candy on the Saturday night when everybody else has gone into Soledad. She uses it as a derogatory term, as an insult to them, because she's trying to sort of rise above them on the ladder of power during that conversation. There's a lot of jostling for power going on. But very much they're kind of treated as one big bunch of homeless people, a bunch of bindle stiffs. The third point is that they're valued only for their economic worth rather than as individuals. They're very much reliant and dependent on their employer for financial security. Look at how insecure Candy feels as he's getting older, and he's very aware that at any point the employer could think, well, it's not worth keeping him anymore. He can't even feed the chickens or clean out the bunkhouse anymore, so I'll just get rid of him. Candy says, just as soon as I can't swamp out no bunkhouses, they'll put me on the county. He realises that, what little financial security he does have in terms of having a roof over his head and somewhere to eat and sleep and to live, that could be gone at some point. Old age for him is not necessarily going to be comfortable. The next point is that a lot of them are living life in fear of the powerful in a rigidly hierarchical society. And I would look there at the tension between George and Lenny in their conversation with the boss. So they've just arrived at the ranch. Look at their conversation with the boss on pages 42 to 43. Look at George has briefed Lenny, hasn't he? He's told him not to say anything because he thinks that the moment Lenny opens his mouth, he'll put his foot in it, and the boss will realise that Lenny's got learning difficulties and won't want to employ them. Okay, but look at this a couple of times when it says George scowled at Lenny. There's that kind of sort of aggression coming out, but it's fear, isn't it? Really. Yeah, look at that tension, look at that fear there. George is desperate to make sure that Lenny doesn't say anything because he realises this could cost them the job. And if they don't have the job, well, what are they going to eat? Where are they going to live? Yeah. So there's very much a kind of a fear of the powerful. Those who have the money and the rank and the status can impose themselves on others because of the fear that those who are being employed have. And the last point here to do with the migrant workers is that there's a sense, I think, in which that they're presented by Steinbeck as being imprisoned or trapped by economic constraints. Look at the constant reference of chains here, for instance. It's like as if they're prisoners of their own circumstances. Look at the references to the jingle of trace chains and the rattle of halter chains. There are chains everywhere, and it's emphasizing the idea of them being trapped and imprisoned by these economic constraints. They can't rise up out of it. Women. We're trying to look at different groups and types of people within the novel. You're going to have to do a little bit of work here. So I've given you some points. What you could do for a vision is find some quotes that you would use to support these points. And then you've got a decent essay plan on that section then, haven't you? So my first point is that they're viewed as possessions, lacking independence or value in their own right. Well, I'll give you a quote for that one. It could just be Curly's wife. The fact that that's how she's referred to. She's referred to as his possession. We never actually find out her name, do we? So you could use Curly's wife's, the term that she's referred to, the fact that she's called Curly's wife throughout by Steinbeck, is kind of Steinbeck emphasizing that. They're very often portrayed in a misogynistic light by men, condemned as childish and trivial and promiscuous, etc. Maybe have a look at the way that Candy talks about Curly's wife throughout the novel. See what quotes you could find there, because very often the way that he talks about Curly's wife is quite sexist. The women, in terms of their opportunities in 1930s America, they have very limited opportunities, don't they? There are very few women in the novel at all, but the only women that really are described in any detail would be the prostitutes. Look at the pages that describe them and their lives. And of course, Curly's wife, and she's very much trapped in an unhappy marriage. Perhaps find a quote to do with Curly's wife being trapped in that unhappy marriage with Curly. They're also an easy target and blamed unjustly. For that, I would definitely look at chapter 5, where Candy, after Curly's wife has died, look at his rant as he seeks to blame Curly's wife for everything that's gone wrong. Racism. We could look at Crooks as an example of someone who suffers. He's very much a victim of segregation, isn't he? He's got his own little hut, little shack on the side of the barn, hasn't he? So him as a victim of segregation. Find a quote that really supports that idea of him not being allowed in the bunkhouse, and what his bedroom is how his bedroom is described. He's treated as subhuman. He's treated as an animal at times. Look at how his bed is described. Look at the location of his bedroom. Look at how they treat him. This is way before chapter 4. This is in chapter 2. Look at how they treat him at Christmas. I think there's very much evidence that he's treated as an animal there. Again, you're going to need to find these quotes. You've got to do a little bit of work here. Make your way round the novel, find the quotes, and then obviously you're going to need to learn them for the exam. He lives a life of fear, and he's a victim of oppression. Look at everything that Crook says in chapter 4, and find some evidence of the kind of fear that he has, the oppression that he's experienced in the past. But of course, it's quite ironic that he is also the character who seems to value learning and education and literacy and reading the most, and yet he's the least powerful. What evidence do we have that he really values reading? Look at the description of his room for that. And then finally, loneliness. They live in a place called loneliness, in that it's called Soledad, which is Spanish for loneliness. They play a game called loneliness at times, don't they? They play solitaire. You could look at also loneliness in relation to masculinity. I think there's kind of sort of evidence that a very stereotypical image of masculinity in terms of being a hard man that's not reliant on others, that is completely independent. There's evidence that that's what leads to the loneliness, I think, of lots of the characters. Their migrant lifestyle, the economic context in which they're living, also it means that it's difficult for them to put down roots and to establish relationships. Again, we're back to the suffering of migrant workers here, but that's one of the primary things that makes it, leads these men to living very, very lonely lives, I think. Look at their reactions to loss. So look at Candy after his dog is shot. There's very much evidence that following that, he then seeks companionship. So he's just been separated from his lifelong companion, his dog, and now he's seeking companionship in terms of trying to get in on the dream with George and Lenny and seeking some companionship for his old age. Also, look at George after he shoots Lenny. Look at the last couple of pages of the novel. There's a lot of evidence that George and Slim then start to form this friendship in the most desperate of moments. What happens? This human impulse to seek companionship, to seek comfort from someone else, to not be completely isolated, seems evident in the way that George and Slim start to form a friendship. Look at how Slim goes and sits right next to George, sits very close to him. Look at the dialogue between the two. There's very much evidence, just like Candy seeking companionship after separation from his dog, that's what George is doing at this moment. So have a look through these examples and make sure you've got the points in mind so that you can construct some really detailed paragraphs, but make sure you've also got some clear quotes to support each of them. And constantly what you need to be doing is linking it back to the context. So asking yourself the question, what is Steinbeck saying here about life in 1930s America? And the more specific you can be about what he's saying about 1930s America, the more you'll be hitting the marks of that context part of the assessment objectives.